All right. So this conversation came to our mind because you have to talk about AI, right? That's the big deal now, and somehow we have to tie it to climate. Well, believe it or not, there's a lot going on in this space, and there's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement around the solutions that technologies like AI are opening up in the climate space. But there are also concerns. If you're a lawyer, I'm sure you're already thinking about all the risks and all the problems that AI poses, especially for climate predictions. But hopefully, with this extremely diverse panel, backgrounds that I don't think intersect at all, hopefully we can tease out what are the opportunities, how far are we with using this technology for solution making, and then what should we watch out for? So I'd love to just pass on and ask Catherine, Will, Daphne to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about yourselves first. So why don't you kick it off, Catherine?
Great, thank you. And thank you for hosting this conference. It's great to be here. I'm a Berkeley Law alum, and while my badge says Stanford Codex Center for Legal Informatics, I really am excited to be here. My work at Stanford is on climate data policy. As an attorney, thinking about how do we create the markets that are going to drive decarbonization. So excited to be here with you today. Also working internationally on the enabling environment globally for carbon market development. So excited to be here and talking about the promise of AI, where we are and where we need to go.
And hi, everyone. I'm Will Clutter. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Climate AI. Climate AI is the leading climate resilience platform. We use AI to forecast the impacts of extreme weather and climate change on critical industries and supply chains, primarily focused on food and agriculture, but looking at things like disaster response or the movement of industrial goods. And fundamentally, our mission is to help companies leverage data powered by AI to think about adaptation to climate change is a fundamental business problem and how it can improve their operations by better accounting for these types of extremes. So I think it's an interesting place to be in this sort of political moment where sort of some of the regulatory driven use cases are going away, but those that are motivated by sort of this alignment of societal value and business value, we at least hope are going to see continued momentum.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet everyone. I'm Daphne. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Ven, where we provide automated underwriting for new climate asset classes. So think about technology that's proven in the lab and now it needs to scale. So working with big financial institutions, private equity, but also insurance organizations that require insurance underwriting for these particular assets. Might be a bit of an outlier here. My background is mostly in technology. And so we're bringing that to our company where we're mostly focusing on data science and model development.
Thank you for that. So let's actually kick this off with the positive. Will, maybe this is a question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about, just off the cuff, you don't have to go into too much detail, but what are the use cases of AI and specifically in the work that you're doing? What gives you a lot of excitement and hope, and how is this actually helping build climate resilience and adaptation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think fundamentally we think of AI as a tool and an enabler of human decision making, and the types of human decisions that we're trying to support we see it as a time multiplier, so helping things go faster, or an effectiveness multiplier, helping things go better. So time multiplier, an example from our work, is working with seed companies to simulate different climates so that they can understand what seed traits they need to develop that will be more resilient in the future. But there's a lot of really interesting use cases around fusion development, other materials development that will be more sustainable and lead to more climate positive outcomes. And then effectiveness multipliers, how do we make things run more effectively and efficiently? So grid management is a great use case here. At Climate AI, we think about helping companies better manage their supply chain to respond to disasters. So we worked with a building materials company to use AI to simulate how does this upcoming storm season directly lead to the demand for specific building materials across their geographies of interest. And that helps them stage inventory in advance of the events. So for them, that was a huge multi-million-dollar sales lift, but from a disaster response perspective, that's homes being rebuilt more quickly. So it's all about how do we use AI to help the folks in this room solve these problems more effectively.
Well, maybe this is a natural place for us to bring you in, Daphne. Can you tell us a little bit about what Venn does and what gives you kind of solution-making hope here?
Yeah, I think we talked earlier. I think there is a lot of data, but it doesn't mean it's good data, right? So it's the quality of data, not always the quantity of data that matters, particularly when it comes to financing new asset classes. So traditionally, industries will look at historic data sources. Think about actuarial science, where you take sometimes 5 years of historic data. If that is not available, we need to find other data sources in order to provide confidence into that particular investment or asset class. And so what we do is very good at creating synthetic data sets and then also validating that data. So initially, we'll look at adjacent industries, analog data, and we'll add more information to that over time, right? So initially you start with the best guess, basically, and then when you create more real-time data, you get more data streams, you'll incorporate that. As a next step, you need to validate that. So we have physics-based models. We validate that with real industry information and simulations. So we can build simulations for particular industries that will become a bit more intelligent over time, so to say. And then lastly, we can use ensemble modeling, where we take different models from different industries or different assets, and we can integrate some of that with one another. Or let's say, usually you take in the input from a particular subject matter expert, and now we have access to 1,000 experts. And that will create much more confidence in a particular risk or a particular asset class. So it's not necessarily the same, but we're using data in ways that are honestly hard, because we don't have always full confidence of the outcome of that particular model.
And that's what I want to like, and maybe Will and Daphne, maybe this is something that you both run into, and please chime in, anyone. You mentioned historical data. Well, climate change is, it's progressing in unpredictable ways. It's definitely has a history, but gosh, I think the history is happening right now, and then who knows how it will progress in the future. We can do our best to predict things, but my question is, a technology that relies so heavily on historical data, how do you ensure that it's actually accounting for the risks and that it's accurate, that what you're predicting can actually be used to paint a picture of the future or make decisions from that? As you said, it's human-centered decision making. That's what AI helps with. So help me just understand, what do you do when you don't have historical data?
Yeah, I can start out. Well, you have a metric on this. There is some historical data when it comes to climate change. So we do have some baseline. Do you want to start out there?
Yeah, I think so. I think the amount of data we have in Earth observation is far less. Like, I like to compare it to LLMs, because I imagine at this point everyone's has their favorite suite of LLMs they like to use. So if you compare Earth observation to the written word, we are obviously in an incredibly data scarce environment. So we've been observing the Earth for maybe about 50 years, 365 observations. That means each individual point has however many tens of thousands of individual observations, which is not very much. That said, there's still a lot that we can do in terms of backtesting or hindcasting to show how do our forward models accurately predict these events in the past. But I think to your point, a lot of it comes down to, it's not a technical answer, it's a change management answer. How do we build confidence amongst decision makers that this data, and we were talking about this earlier, is not just interesting but useful and creates value? And sometimes that means changing the way that decisions get made to account for the limitations in the data. So, for example, we provide 4 or 5, 6 month forecasts, which will always have some degree of uncertainty. We have some customers who are able to adjust their decision-making time horizons to say, well, we'll make kind of lower risk decisions 6 months out, higher risk decisions when we need more confident data. We have other customers who say, well, we can't make any decision unless you're 90% confident 6 months in advance, because we have to go pitch it to multiple steering committees. These are not companies that are going to be successful leveraging new data sets, and that's going to hurt them over the long term. So it's on us to find those that have that flexibility and work collaboratively with them to understand how does their decision making need to adapt, and how does our data need to adapt to support that decision making.
Yeah, Catherine, maybe you can.
Yeah, just chime in here and say, I think it also depends on what the use case for the AI is. I think the two of you and working in the climate risk space, I mean, we do have much more geospatial data and historical data to use. And so, but when you think about the corporate context, which is what I've really focused on in my work, and for many of you, you're out there going to be general counsels, or you're going to be the chief sustainability officers, or in the business division. When it comes to that, then this historical data, as we know, is pretty much non-existent. And the corporate reporting that we've had has been very much of a Swiss cheese of data. So I think we have to think about sort of this evolutionary trajectory and where we are. And so I think, for us on the corporate side and thinking about decarbonization, I think the question of open data and driving for pooled data is really critical to get past.
Can someone explain open data, please?
I can explain how we would use it. How about that? So I think when there's uncertainty, what we can do is build simulations for particular use cases. And for that, you still start with expert data, right? We don't start with a blank slate. There's a lot of information already out there. You just have to find the right signals and the right way to source it and use it to create a value proposition. And so I think that data comes from open source data sets at times that we can use that are created by government organizations. Granted, some of that is not available right now, but oftentimes created by government organizations and companies offering open source data sets, very valuable to companies like ourselves. Not always valuable in the long term. We still want to get our hands on end-to-end data sources that we can manage and control from a strategic perspective. And so, we use that for simulation. You also mentioned geospatial. I think it's interesting to mention, which is, it's been around for a long time. SAR, optical, different sensors. And you might wonder why it hasn't been used for all the potential use cases that it has. And I think what's different now is we find ways to use raw and unstructured data in ways that are much faster, much more focused on the use case for a particular customer, much more customized for that reason. And for teams like ours, it's easier to take that data and then create real value to our customers.
And maybe just one quick thing to add to this, that I think you touched on the point of open data often coming from government sources. I think the big untapped opportunity, and Catherine, you alluded to this, is private data being shared in a pre-competitive way across companies, because so many companies, every company that we talk to says, we have all the data, we have the best data. And when I meet one of those companies that actually does, that's true, I'll buy everyone in this room a drink. But the reality is it's enough to build basic statistical inferences. It's not enough to power an AI model. And I think the sooner that companies realize that they should be competing with each other in the marketplace and not on trying to build these little fiefdoms of data. And there will be maybe certain areas where that is required. But for the most part, I think there's a lot of value that can be unlocked from adding to the open data mix, this pre-competitive data, and then compete on who can build the best products with it.
Would it be accurate to say that essentially, and I'm still just trying to wrap my mind around the technology's use cases in some ways, but would it be accurate to say that AI, at least in the climate context, helps risk assessments? I mean, is that what it's primarily used for? Or if you can break down kind of like 3 or 4 kind of buckets even, where you think AI is actually being leveraged in a way that's creating value. I would say risk assessment is a very clear place. Catherine, maybe you would say it's reporting. But I'm just curious to know from your individual vantage points, if you had to just reductively talk about this technology, what would you say is the promising use case?
I mean, I'll have to say, I'm going to talk about corporate reporting and leveraging AI in that context, but I think that AI is, as we know, is tremendously powerful, and it's going to impact everything that we're trying to do. And when I'm on panels with solution providers, they're leveraging AI. I think that is so inspiring because, as we well know, we need to deploy solutions at scale that can take scarce public dollars and private dollars and get maximum impact. And that's what AI allows us to do. I think the level of innovation that we're seeing, that are for AI-specific, companies where the solution is based on AI, I find that extremely exciting, the work that you're doing. From my perspective on the corporate reporting side, which is something, as I said that many of you will be thinking about, we should recognize that AI is a very powerful tool for companies to think about not only how to report and be in compliance, but also the next step, which is, okay, once we measure this carbon footprint, it's kind of massive, especially if you include scope 3, what are we going to do about it? So in terms of just stepping back on the corporate side, and I'll just share where I think it's driving change and positive change. One is that we have all, companies have structured and unstructured data right now. When I worked with companies, one of the reasons I'm sitting up here is I worked on California's new climate disclosure rules, both GHG emissions, but also the companion bill around climate risk. And when we sat down with companies, when you really get under the hood, many of them are still using Excel spreadsheets. They've got data in all kinds of places. And so the potential for AI to collect data from your ERP system, to combine it with sensor data, to bring in that PDF of your, some report, and pull out the relevant GHG emissions or climate risk data is, a tremendous opportunity, and we're already seeing that. So I think in the space of just collecting data more efficiently and getting more data, AI is being used in these solutions.
And I can see that being also, if I'm thinking in terms of a department who's, sometimes having to fight for its budget and saying, oh, actually, we have this very quick way of aggregating important information like scope 3. One of the largest reasons for pushback on some of these disclosure rules has been, well, it's costly.
Good point.
So that is very exciting.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from the two of you, Will or Daphne, anything you'd like to add there.
I can go, it's fine. To me, it's more than reporting. Reporting is important, but in our case, it's also about finding hidden risks and risks that maybe you and I wouldn't have thought about, and maybe an actuary wouldn't have thought about, right? And so finding correlations that are sort of out of our normal realm. And then shifting that risk from different players to others. And so especially when it comes to deploying capital, as a lot of people in the room know, I think in order to deploy capital to really big assets, you need to find a way to get an insurance policy or understand the risk, the initial risk, the performance risk, the physical risk, all sort of things maybe that are quite complicated to figure out. And so this is how we can use data to optimize the process and then take it to the next level, which is automating the workflow, some of it at least, and then finding those risks and shifting the risk to a different player in order to, one, accelerate the speed of deployment, and two, increase the confidence in that potential deployment of capital so that we can make more of it to the right climate solutions.
Yeah.
And I would just add to, there's the piece, and I think, Daphne, a lot of what you're doing is you're talking about risk, but I really think of it as almost commercialization of new products. In this case, these are new asset classes or new financial products, but certainly in the R&D realm, we see the ability to do R&D much more quickly. So, and our customers are able to launch new seed varieties that will be more resilient to climate change or have more nutritional benefits or more maybe just be a prettier color strawberry, whatever the business need is. They'll be able to do it a couple years more quickly than they've been able to do it before, because a lot of the simulation work, which is currently, and data collection work that you're talking about, which is currently quite manual, also has a very high carbon footprint because it's usually flying all over the world and running tests, can all be simulated using AI. I think there's also the other piece to add to, so we've got reporting and data aggregation, risk, technology development. I would add just sort of waste reduction of just making sure we do things the right way, the right time, the first time. So we have a lot of customers that are putting inventory in the right markets rather than shipping it around later as information changes. And then the last piece, and this has been a big use case for us, you touched on this, a lot of climate organizations writ large, whether internal sustainability teams, startups, nonprofits, they're typically more likely to be resource scarce. And so it's one of the challenges of AI is often like, what is that, when we talk about increased productivity, what does that mean for jobs? Well, in our work, we're usually significantly overworked and don't have enough resources to get the job done. Productivity enhancements will help sort of everything that we do, and we've seen it a lot in our basic processes.
Sorry, no. What I really like about that, though, is also, and you see the same, the cost of data is coming down in certain cases, particularly geospatial, right? Yeah. Launch cost is coming down, constellation operation cost is going down. And so for us to get access to those right data sources, create a better value prop while the cost of certain data sources comes down is amazing. So the timing is great.
Yeah, just to add on the sort of the streamlining and lessening burden, I think that right now, I mean, I'm seeing companies already changing in how they think about this. I think if you talked to most, Fortune 500 companies a couple of years ago about whether it was Europe's imposition of new reporting standards or what we're doing here in California or what was going to happen at the federal level with disclosure requirements, they would have said, like, hair on fire, we don't know how to do it, it's going to cost us millions of dollars. And I think the good news is that technology and AI is helping with that, is really bringing down the cost of reporting. And I think to your point, Daphne, then it then allows a company to spend its time leveraging data to think about what are they going to do once they figure out what that carbon footprint is. And so I think this question of the enabling environment, and as lawyers, we think about what creates new markets, and that's really, for me, the point of all of this, is we have to create new markets. Right now, I think our standards are not requiring the kind of high-quality data that would also push. So we've got some kind of tailwinds and some headwinds, but I do feel like the opportunity to do automated reporting and then sort of that what-if analysis, those predictions to help decarbonization in a company, I think that's where we see, we want them spending their time doing that.
Yeah, and I love all of this, I'll be very honest, but you put me in a difficult position, and I have to play devil's advocate, so I'm apologizing in advance. AI is also known to have its own carbon footprint. And this is a question for the whole panel. Please jump in as you would. I don't think anyone's got the best answer for any of this, so I'm going to depressurize this question. It's amazing to see the various ways in which AI can accelerate, let's say, action, and corporate action specifically. But using AI has its own carbon footprint. We all have heard various analogies as to how many cities it could power with one prompt ChatGPT uses, or how many data centers need to be built in order to meet the demands, and how much carbon I could go on and on. How does one square with that? How do you square with using AI to build climate solutions while also using a technology that has a negative climate impact in some ways? I'm going to just remind you, there's no right answer, because I'm very curious and I still don't know how to answer this question. So I would love to hear your thoughts. What questions come to your mind when I ask this?
So there's two points. So one sort of just very quick point is that, like, when we think about the massive carbon footprint of AI, we are often talking about these like larger consumer-facing applications, whereas a lot of the applications we're talking about are, like in the case of like weather forecasting, it's actually replacing a more carbon-intensive technology, which is supercomputers. And so, in a lot of, as we think, if we break the problem down in a case-by-case basis, it's actually potentially, even in its own operation, forget the impact, is a lower footprint. But I think more broadly, there's an analogy that a former chief sustainability officer told me, which is like, when Howard Schultz created Starbucks, all he wanted to do was create a European-style coffee experience in the United States. Never did he imagine that, flash forward 10 years or whatever it was, he would control the global coffee market. And by the time he did, then they started implementing all these sort of fair trade practices, et cetera, but there was already this huge amount of damage done. So sustainability to this individual and to me means, how do we get it right from the start? So we know that there is going to be huge impacts of AI from a carbon emission standpoint. We also know there's going to be huge impacts on the nature of work, and gains in places and losses in others. But can we start this process, start this journey with those impacts in mind and design the outcome that we would like to see? And I think we already see a lot of, at least some of the larger tech companies, being as aggressive on renewable deployment as they are on AI deployment, because they see that these two things need to move in parallel. I would hope to see more of that. Honest
perspective, no, I'm an entrepreneur. I think, it's happening. We're not going to do anything about it. I don't know if you've seen the predictions on data usage, building new data centers in different parts of the world. What I like about it is it's an incentive to think about different sources of energy, reducing the cost of renewables, making that a bit more competitive. That's really what I really like about it, thinking differently about data centers, how we store information, how we transport it, what infrastructure do we need in the future. So it's a great forcing function for that. So we might as well do that the right way, and then maybe we can use AI to figure that out. But yeah, I do see consumer applications and question, do we really need this? But that's out of my control. I think what we should do is use it the right way as much as we can and think about how we use compute. And so the way we do that is there a real value prop? The good thing about a startup is it has to be economically viable, so you can't just throw around data sources. You have to think about the value prop. You have to really, because you're constrained, right? You have to really think about how we're going to use this data. Is it actually valuable to this customer? Which is why I think it's nice that it's done by smaller companies versus just big corporations. We much more feel that forcing function. And so I think we just need to be very conscious of the consequences and figure out what we can do now to prevent those negative consequences in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I would say that if you're going to use compute for climate, that's should be at the top of the pyramid of the things we want to do. And I think that these climate solution providers are the least of our worries, as we're saying. And that's why also, I'm a believer in a compliance regime for reporting, because I've seen a lot of innovation. We've got Facebook and, we've got other big tech companies really taking seriously, investing in renewable energy so that they can continue growing as companies. So that's the point of creating the right enabling environment, is because you're then making them responsible for that footprint, and that they have to build in the decarbonization strategies that need to go with that. So I actually think we do need more regulation, and so it's not only when it comes to climate, but AI generally. We're in this kind of very awkward phase where there's a lot of concern about AI, but we're having, policymakers have a difficult time keeping up with technology. It's very difficult to kind of calibrate correctly. And I think we all need to spend more time on that.
Well, I did some research on this question myself, because I know it's not an easy one. And the World Economic Forum actually did a study on how much will AI harm. And in fact, they found that annually AI will be adding 0.4 to 1.6 gigatons of carbon emissions annually by 2035. So in the next 10 years, we're going to be starting to see that much added to the burden on this planet. But, and this is because I'm an optimist, and you can hold that against me, it's totally fine. They also predicted and measured that due to the acceleration in adoption and solution making, they actually predict specifically adoption of solar, wind, EVs, and alternative proteins. They actually predict that it will contribute to a reduction of 3 to 6 gigatons annually by 2035 as well. So on balance, according to the World Economic Forum, there is some positive value.
And you probably got that
created
from ChatGPT, didn't you?
Exactly.
That was a good search.
And then I planted a lot of trees, and I then picked up a lot of trash because I had to offset my carbon impact. So anyways, I wanted to also go a little bit more into prediction. I think one of the most exciting pieces of AI is its ability to tell us what's going to happen. I mean, I think the reason why climate change as a topic has been very difficult to politically sell, if you would, has been the impact is local, conversations global. And unless it's happening to you, it's harder to actually prioritize that as a political agenda item or a personal agenda item. A lot of people who are moved by climate actually have personal experience with it, or the legislators do. But I think prediction capabilities, especially when you back it with accurate data models and accurate solutions, you can actually make a case like, hey, by the way, this piece of land you're living on today in about 30 years might not be there, and here's like all of this data to prove it. You don't have to do anything with it. You can still live here, but your children may not inherit this land. I feel like that's like a good enough, if I told my mom that, I think she'd be pretty like, we gotta sell, you know? So I would love to hear a little bit about how AI forecasting works in terms of climate change. And perhaps this is a question for either you, Will, if you can. What can we say how accurate this is? And what are the current limitations of using AI to predict climate outcomes or climate risks?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, when we think about sort of AI in the space of prediction, weather and climate predictions effectively operate on physical simulations. I mean, depending upon what time scale you're talking about, this might work slightly differently, but the base example is we take a picture of where the Earth is today, and then we simulate all the possible directions that it could go from here based on, what cloud is over here, does it go over here in rain, or does it go that way, et cetera. And it's all these sort of ultimately linear relationships. As mentioned, this is very carbon-intensive process, but it's also very limited in that it takes sort of only the sort of point-in-time information. With AI, we can look at more complex correlations than we've been able to look at in the past. So, for example, when Climate AI predicts hurricanes, we are able to take information from sea buoys that are currently just used by ocean freight to understand conditions at sea and identify relationships between sort of ocean temperatures at different levels of the ocean all over the world and the likelihood of hurricane strength and then how that hurricane will impact landfall. So fundamentally, we're bringing not necessarily new data to the conversation, but new relationships of that data and expected outcomes. The biggest gap is what we sort of covered earlier, is that ultimately these relationships are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively limited, which is why the creation of synthetic data, which Daphne is talking about, is, I think, perhaps the single most critical unlock. And so a lot of the existing AI weather forecasts are still using observed data to train, and there's been a couple that have been trained entirely on synthetic data. We'll see if that works. The only other thing I would add is what we see at Climate AI is improving the fundamental forecast is meaningful, but linking it to the decision is even more meaningful. And so that's where taking industry data and marrying that with climate forecast data, so we are not providing a prediction of January's will be, or July's will be 15% hotter in the future, but we can say the yield of this crop will decline by 3 to 4%, because temperatures above critical thresholds are going to increase by this amount, and we've used AI to determine that there's a relationship here. Or demand for certain products may change. Like I use the building materials example. The demand for roof shingles in Florida this year is going to be 40% higher because of the winds are going to exceed this certain amount. Delays and disruptions in shipping, you're going to have a 25-day delay throughout your whole season due to hurricane activities at ports. So making the data intelligible by non-climate folk, because then they don't even need to care about climate change. They just need to care about the business impact that you're telling them, and of course, get confidence in that decision. But that's what we found to be the biggest unlock.
Yeah, I think the story we were talking about earlier, we're mentioning older industries, and I think there's a bit of a misalignment when it comes to going to market as a company that works with data, right? It's not that insurance companies aren't data companies, it's that oftentimes data is acquired, and so their business model isn't always familiar with the SaaS business model. And I've been at a conference, a big insurance company, or a big insurance conference where we had to explain what an API is. And so we can talk about models all day, but we need to figure out ways to use it quicker and get the right adoption in the markets that we want to work with. Insurance, I think in particular, is interesting because you can influence the outcome if you use what's called parametric insurance or have ways to influence the number of claims, and therefore it's a business problem, again, not a climate problem, and that's what we want to move away from. Even though we call ourselves sort of climate companies, we can influence that outcome, and it's a win-win for all the stakeholders. And this is a multi-stakeholder problem, and so we have to make sure that everybody involved gets to have a positive outcome.
That's fantastic. And honestly, I think we all know we can keep going on this.